Hello.
Hello. My name is Jan Grassley. I'm a consultant and I'm former president of UN Women UK. So a little statement first, I'm afraid. Companies speak about having a strong purpose to maintain focus on business success. To maintain a strong focus on achieving women's equality and economic empowerment, I think we need to anchor purpose with systemic approved change for the benefit of society. And I think you touched on that. International and national legislation starts the process, but attitudinal changes about women's role in society take longer and are most challenging. Changing attitudes towards women and girls movements such as He for She campaign, which has been taken up by government, the corporate sector and civil society, start the process. But do you feel that education and training, access to finance, knowledge and expertise are really the key criteria for helping women?
Gentlemen.
Hello, I'm Jerry Boyle from Care International. So really my point would be, we've heard from both the Secretary of State and Tina Fordham, I think, in mentioning of the importance of financial inclusion, which we as Care as an organisation have worked on for 25 years. And really believe very strongly that giving women access to savings, particularly for women really in the poorest communities, is absolutely central to beginning the process of economic empowerment. And within that, we also think that women's savings groups can really be one of the key first steps towards women achieving broader empowerment and being able to change the attitudes of the men and boys around them, which we do in a lot of our work. So my question is, given that we've already got about 10 million people in sub-Saharan Africa in savings groups, so it is a technique that works at scale, we already know. To what extent would the panel like to comment on where we could find the financing to extend those savings groups to every woman on the planet who needs one, who needs access to one?
Good. Next question, I believe you had your hand up.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrea Milano and I work for UN Women. My question relates to the importance of making sure that any recommendation of the panel does not leave migrants and refugees behind. The reason why I say this is because we have almost 120 million migrant women and refugee women. And also because this year, and particularly in September, we not only have the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of the first report of the high-level panel, but there's also going to be a very important meeting on addressing large movements and refugees and migrants in New York. It's going to be a summit at the heads of state level. So my question is whether the panel is considering two important aspects. The first one being that its recommendations are always inclusive for migrants. So basically that any measure that aims at promoting women's economic empowerment is not linked necessarily to citizenship, residence, and so that it can be applied to every woman who is in a certain territory. And the second question is whether the panel is thinking about addressing some of the specific areas that would make a difference for these almost 120 million migrants, such as, for example, the Domestic Workers Convention. We know that more than 80% of domestic workers worldwide are women, and most of them are migrants, and other great sources of great policies for areas of origin, transit, and destination, such as, for example, the CEDAW General Recommendation number 26 that is specifically on women migrant workers. So whether you will always take a migration perspective in all recommendations, and whether you are thinking about acting specifically on the specificities for
Thank you very much. We take one question from the gentleman here, and then the woman in the orange top at the end of the row.
Thank you. Tom Sanderson from BBC Media Action. Fiza, you mentioned that one barrier is lack of role models and stereotyping and maybe lack of confidence. Does the panel think that media interventions, and BBC and I know Girl Hub have done quite a number of interventions like this, can help at scale to support women and help them overcome such barriers?
Just at the end of the row, and then we'll move back to the panel.
Hello, Stacey Adams from Rally International. We've just done a consultation in country around women's empowerment and in terms of entrepreneurship. And one of the big barriers they're telling us is around safety and security. They're not actually confident to, say, move villages for jobs. They're not even sometimes confident within villages around the impact of them having more money in relation to the impact on family or the risk of violence. And I wondered to what extent that's being addressed.
Okay, there's quite a broad range of questions. I'm going to pick out 3 to start with, and if other people would like to then enhance the other ones, I'm very happy to come back to them. The first one is from Tom from the BBC, which is about media intervention. Now, this does actually have a kind of a wide-scale impact if used correctly, and I'd like to ask all 4 of you for your expertise on that. The point from, sorry, was it Gerard? Jerry, on banking and how to actually expand banking resources to essentially people who are at the bottom of the scale and introduce them into a financial life in the beginnings of the economy. And the third one actually is on refugees, which is obviously is a section, but it's not the whole thing we're talking about. But these are potentially women who are moving into new communities, and there is a chance to change them. So if I could just ask you for a couple of brief thoughts on whichever of those subjects grabs you most. I'm going to start with you, Justine.
Okay, I mean, I think one of the trickiest things to unlock is this issue of social norms, both actually outside of work but also inside work. There was this research done that showed that girls growing up, I think it was in one part of sub-Saharan Africa, had big ideas about what they wanted to do. If you asked them age 7 to 8, by the time they were 13, their attitudes were bang in line with their parents. So clearly, something is happening in the intervening period. So this issue of attitudes and then how role models can help keep expectations and aim attitudes higher rather than lower is really important to my mind. And I think it's a what works agenda. There are role models internationally, nationally, and also locally. And I think grounded role models, perhaps whether it's someone in your town, in your village, in your family, who can be that one person who encourages you and helps you work out where you want to get to, is critical. And actually, a lot of the discussions that we have underline that it can just be one contact that can be enough. So that's the powerful thing about role models. It doesn't have to be multifaceted. It can be one discussion that changes someone's life. On the second couple of points, and your point, Jerry, about savings, I agree with that. And it's about having a business case. And what we need to understand is really what the broader macroeconomic value is of this. And I think once you start to capture those broader benefits alongside the ones for the individual, then you start to understand, if you like, what the global public good or the national public good is that makes it more investable by not just, departments like my own, but by business and by government. And then on the last piece, I think we're seeing a really welcome shift in the policy approach and investment approach in relation to migration and refugees right now. And one of the most important shifts we're seeing is this understanding that actually jobs is a key part of how you help everyone. And I think that has to extend to jobs in the context of women being able to get them. It makes so much sense to enable people to be able to support themselves rather than having them totally reliant on the international humanitarian system, combined with the fact that, that strips people of their dignity if it persists over a protracted period of time, and it's not good for host communities in the end either. But I would also say that I think what this shows is that, signing up to resolutions and policies, one thing, the key is delivery. And that's what we need to work through on this report, is how can we actually make sure that things get delivered? And partly that's about some of the rest of what needs to change around not just governments, but sort of investment, business, and attitudes.
Tina, can I ask you about the business, about the banking question? I know it's at a completely different scale from the banking you do, but does any part of your research look at how to engage women in finance at that level in terms of saving and economic education?
Well, not yet, but you've given me a very good idea for one of the chapters in the next report. I have to answer from my perspective as a political scientist working in research, because I'm not a spokesperson for the bank and I don't work on that side of things. But, as a research analyst, I know what we need more of is data. It's just, there are so many problems and so many challenges. To get a sense of how to best target resources, how to understand the scale of the problem and the potential upside is what we need to address any of these issues. And I know as a research analyst that it's very hard to do. So I think to be as technical as possible is crucial. I mean, we talk about what in the report what I call the WG3 effect, and things like title, access to savings, to mortgages, to credits, and all of this is a big part of realizing it. But maybe to tie in with the refugee issue, one of the things that I feel very conscious of is that whether it's the refugee crisis or even the diversity challenge or any of these big macro challenges, that there's a sense of fatigue about the scale of these issues and how to address them. And so I always think about Angela Merkel and her approach as a quantum physicist now in government, which is to break things into small pieces so you don't get overwhelmed. And I think that's what we have to do with any of these things, because we're probably going to have to prioritize and sequence, and to do that we have to understand what we can do and which aspects can have the biggest effect. Can I say something about the safety issue?
Please do.
Is that allowed?
That's fine.
In a previous research paper I did called Vox Populi Risk, which looked at the wave of protests post-Arab Spring and the rise of populist and non-mainstream political figures, we looked at the large-scale protests in a number of emerging markets countries. And one of them, of course, was in India, following the horrific rape and murder of the young woman coming home from the cinema. And the way that I think that we might think about this is the extent to which it mobilized India's new middle classes, who were demanding more of their leadership, of their police, and of men in society, so that they're not educating their daughters so that it's not safe for them to be able to take a bus home from a cinema, let alone women villagers trying to travel to go places to get things done. So while that was a horrible event, it certainly focused minds in a powerful way. So I think that social change, we must remember, is unsettling and destabilizing, but these kinds of processes can focus minds about what needs to be done and really test the limits of what's no longer socially acceptable, if that makes sense. Can
I just come in on that? There's a push-pull thing here. I mean, sometimes politicians are behind where people are. And you get a situation that really demonstrates that, and the politics has to catch up. And then there are other times when actually politicians can really pull things along through public policy. And I think it's working out which side you're on in terms of whether it's a push thing or a pull thing in these different elements of this problem that I think is partly the key to success. So there are some places where it is absolutely about public policy to give it a shove. There are other points where, frankly, laws just need to catch up with where society expects them to be. But in doing so, it can draw a line under where a country has got to that is really important to sort of, frankly, underpin that change for good.
I would also say credit to the media at this point in time for actually
Absolutely,
having
yeah.
taken
Totally.
a story that was essentially a kind of an Indian national story and turned it into a global story, to the point where India itself felt the pressure of the world looking at it and asking how it could have a society in which such things happened. So it's a brief answer to Tom's question. I'd like to just take a few more questions from the audience. Somebody in the back corner of the room, I've lost track of where the microphones are. There's one coming towards you. And can we have a question from this lady here? Sorry, do go ahead.
Hi, this is Claire Twelvetrees from the Cherie Blair Foundation for Women. We work with women entrepreneurs to grow and scale their businesses. We help them through capacity building, training and technology. Just come back from Rwanda at the World Economic Forum, where we're working with CARE, and I'm really glad that you raised that the scale point, because I think that actually having 10 million in saving groups is a way to potentially reach the scale that we're looking for. So in Rwanda, we were working with CARE to use mobile technology in terms of working also with the Kenya Commercial Bank to enhance the availability of financial products that were available for women. It's not an easy journey. There are many challenges. But I think my question is this. I think in order to reach that scale, how can we leverage technology and the financial sector in order to reach more women and to empower them financially? Thanks.
Question here.
Hi, I'm Helen Parker. I work at the water team here at ODI. So we've already talked about the issues that constrain women in relation to childcare burdens, in relation to access to credit. Another major issue, as you know, is access to safe water and sanitation. I want to know how the panel thinks we can begin to address these multiple constraining factors which reduce women's time that they have for productive activities. Like, how can we address the sort of supply side constraints as well as, you know, creating more jobs and creating quotas and creating economic opportunities?
Question from here in the front row.
Thank you. I'm Diane Sheard from the One Campaign, and I have a question a bit more broadly, just economic empowerment. In our poverty sexist report, one of the constraints in actually writing the report is a lack of data, and there's a serious gender crisis in data, in fact knowing where women are, knowing how many girls there are, knowing how many girls should have access to education, healthcare, etc. And I just wonder how we can use the work that the panel is doing and the work on economic empowerment to try and help support filling that data gap. Thanks.
Okay. And another question from here in the front row. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Caroline Harper. I work here at the ODI and lead the team on gender and exclusion and generations. My question is, I actually think you have to do many things at the same time, and you can't make that many choices. And we are indeed doing many things at the same time around the world. But my question specifically is what to do with the school-age population. There's a big gain to be made. There many are not in school, but a lot are in school. And what would your priorities be for the school-age population, boys and girls? Because in 10 years' time, they will be the women of the future, and there may be some big gains to be made there. And I would just add that I think there's a lot to be done around sexual and reproductive health in schools, because if you're not in control of your reproductive health, then how are you going to be economically empowered?
We're going to start with that very specific question about what we're going to teach the generation who are currently in schools. Can I start with that with you, Fiza? What would you like to see as school education for the presumably 5 to 15-year-olds, both boys and girls?
That's very interesting. I haven't really thought about that because we don't work with schools or curriculum. But I would just like to take that a step up towards more of college and universities, because that's what we're really doing, and maybe that can translate down as well. In Pakistan alone, I'll just give you an example that we have around 1.1 million university graduates going out of college every year, out of which 62% are usually women. But 48% of these graduates never make it to any jobs. And another 15-20% make it to a job for a year or two before they get married. So perhaps this needs to be, again, taken back to the school level, to the early education years, to teach the girls that it's not just, you're not just getting an education to get into a good marriage proposal, which is a norm in countries like Pakistan. You're getting educated to be able to open your own doors, to create an identity for yourself. And not just for the universities and schools do not only need to focus on the girls themselves, but on their families and parents, and engaging them to make them understand why education is important and why sort of transforming that education into a career is important, because that's what the platform that the girls need. We've already started trying to do that in Pakistan, establishing mentoring councils for girls and their families in universities and colleges. And perhaps you're right, that needs to sort of take a step back to the school level as well, because that's really where the foundation begins.
Okay, who would like to answer? There was a question which had, there was two questions quite related to two sides of the same coin. One was about the absolute sort of drag on basic life, which includes things like, how do we get clean water, how do you do childcare, really fundamental things that hold people back, hold women back in particular in their progress. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've started talking, it was Claire over there, talking about technology and how you can start using technology to transform people's lives. Now, these are at two opposite ends of the spectrum. would you like to talk a little bit about how you get to women who really are still struggling with literally who's carrying the water to that level where you can transform, you can do something transformational?
Well, I think that one of the important things is that, I'm sorry, that people that work for Audi is that the society of the future. And I think this is very important because, especially if I relate it to the public policies is the investment that we must create for a future society. And I will maybe I just can't answer immediately the question about technology, but one of the things that before trying to answer your question, I want to put this on the floor. And what about remittance of migration? Most of the remittance of the households that are very poor are for their own food, not for educate their own children. But besides that, and this is very important, most of these households also have microcredit. And most of the microcredit, they are not for making to be better entrepreneurs. So I think that one of the things that we have to relate is where are these microfinance institutions giving the credit? And most of the credit, if you see the database that the World Bank has, and it is in the internet and it is free, you are going to see that the profits are very high, and especially for women. So the answer is that women are very profitable. And this is terrible. And we have to stop, and I would like to put in the panel, in this report, that we have to regulate microfinance, especially with the profits.
So you're saying microfinance is in fact not doing women particularly any good?
Well, there are some projects that are very good, and International Development Bank, they have special programs that has been very successful, but not all of them. So we have to be aware of what they are doing, because in the first world, many people invest, and especially the funds, the pension funds, and the institutional investors invest in these microfinance institutions, and they are all around the world. They have different names in each particular country, but they are the same. It is a real business. So I think we have to regulate that. And the other point is about technology. I think we have to invest a lot in education. And we just can't reduce the social budget. And another thing that I want to put on the floor is that, and I saw this in Bolivia. I was invited a few years ago to Gregoria Pasa Foundation. It was an NGO. And I saw how they work. The women are very happy going to work because now they are not going and they are not staying at home, and they are around the country. No, everybody is doing sweaters, scarves, whatever. But that transportation for them, it's so terrible how they live, that even one of the problems is nutrition. Because why nutrition? Because when they are, let's say, embarazed? Embarrassed. Yes. No, so you have a problem there because you don't have the nutrition to have a better baby. So even if this baby or this little girl or boy goes to the school, he or she wouldn't finish school because he doesn't have or she doesn't have the nutrition to finish even primary school.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop you there. We're talking there about kind of that level of poverty, which means you're stuck in this particular cycle. This is actually a question for FISA. It's the dual question of poverty, lack of resources, and technology, and what can you actually do to transform it? And I think this is where you come to the fore.
That's where the foundation comes in. So absolutely. This is where I think the private sector can play a part, like we did back in Pakistan, to be able to understand what are all the problems, the real problems on ground that the poor are facing or the poor women are facing, and try to club together with creative, turnkey, integrated solutions. I call them integrated and intelligent solutions that actually sort of fulfill all multi-dimensional problems with multi-dimensional solutions by one very simple, turnkey, scalable model that can be replicated. And that's what we did in Pakistan by a project, Lighting a Million Lives, where we went into completely off-grid, poorest of the poor populated villages. No access to electricity, absolute darkness. And we gave them a model of energy access through solar energy. We electrified the entire village with solar and trained local women from the communities as light ladies. So they became the energy entrepreneurs, creating a sustainable model where they're building income and renting the lanterns out to the villagers, while it became a model of economic change as well, because those energy entrepreneurs became the agents of change for every little village. So that's how you can tackle multiple solutions, multiple problems with diverse solutions with a trickle-down approach, so that you can tap a larger base and make the model really scalable and adaptable, as Justin said. It can't be just a one-time go. It has to be scalable globally.
Okay. I'm going to take a few more questions from the room, and then I'll be taking some comments from online. So if you are messaging in now, please message even more, and I will look at you in a second. A woman at the front, in the front row, please. Where are the microphones? Woman in the front row, please. And then afterwards, woman over here.
Thank you. One of the areas identified by the high-level panel is around wage gaps. Sorry, my name's Rachel Noble. I'm from ActionAid UK. And certainly from ActionAid's perspective, I mean, we'd really urge the panel to look more broadly at the decent work agenda, because obviously it's not just about wage gaps, it's about being paid an equal wage for work of equal value, being paid a living wage. It's about the conditions of work, and it's also about having a secure contract. And what we're seeing increasingly is a trend towards the growing informalisation and casualisation of labour. It was already a trend before the crash. It's been accentuated substantially since then, as the ILO has documented, and the ILO has pointed out that it's increasing, contributing to levels of inequality. And this has a huge impact on women's ability to form and join unions and engage in collective action to claim their rights. It massively undermines their economic inequality. It affects their sexual and reproductive health and rights in terms of denial of maternity leave. So my question really is to what extent will the high-level panel be looking at this broader decent work agenda, thinking about women working in global supply chains, perhaps in particular, and the role of corporates in that regard? Thank you.
And I'm just going to supplement that question with a comment from Renee Giovarelli at the Resource Equity, who is asking, again, a legal-based question, which is women in agricultural society do not have clear rights and control over the land they farm. Again, land rights are critical to economic empowerment, but that forms part of the same thing of what sort of contracts that should be available to them. We had a question over here.
Hello, my name is Mariella. Mariella Magnelli. I work for Womankind Worldwide. And my question is, so you have mentioned women's reproductive responsibilities and the burden of unpaid care work, which, as we know, is a main barrier to women's economic empowerment. I guess my question to the panel is, how do we overcome this barrier in a context of austerity measures and reduced protections for women? This applies, to the example of Mexico, but also here in the UK.
Okay, and we have another question here, and then one in the back row, just behind.
Hello, it's Daria from Maxwell Stamp. My question touches somewhat on what Tina has said, and that is gender-responsive budgeting. Now, it's not a very new idea, but my question is precisely that. Why is it, do you think, despite this being around for, at least 20 years, we do not really see gender-responsive budgeting being implemented across the world, in developed and developing countries?
Okay. And the question in the back row, just behind.
Hi, I'm Thalia Kidder. I'm with Oxfam. And Oxfam and Christian Aid and others have pointed out that regressive tax policies and inadequate government revenues really hamper the ability of governments to be able to fund public services and pensions and education, which are a real critical foundation to women being able to enter the labor force and to benefit from the work that they do. So I'm wondering how the panel sees that economic policies such as taxation and revenue collection will be addressed, so that this isn't only a focus on how individual women get jobs and stay in jobs.
Okay, so we've got 3 areas here. They're quite big areas. One, we are going to finally tackle reproductive, the fact that women are the mothers and doing the childcare. We're also going to have a look at the legal frameworks as to how women achieve some form of equality either in the workplace or on their own agricultural land. What are the sort of mechanisms we can institute? And I'd like quite specific answers to these. And the third is gender on the basis of gender-responsive budgets, which in fact also ties in from the question to Oxfam, which is how do you actually gear tax and revenue to make governments think financially how they place their money. So could I ask Justine first on reproductive rights, childcare, what do we do?
So, well, I'll quickly try and canter through. So I think there's a bit of this that is about understanding, if you like, a life cycle approach to how we get women more economically empowered. So it's about changing prospects for women who are already, adult and wanting to be able to have better opportunity, but then also building a stronger pipeline of educated girls. But part of that is about addressing the barriers. And one of the main barriers is that the minute girls hit puberty, they have risks of being married early, of starting a family before they're ready to, and that then means they drop out. And this is why the data question that one raised is really, really important, because actually what we don't have is really good data about, where in the pipeline, as it were, women are dropping out. We broadly know, and a lot of our work in DFID is focused around adolescence, because we know that's a big risk, but I'm going to guess there are other parts of it that we need to focus on too. So that's the first thing. And sexual reproductive health is part of how you manage that. The second one, on legal frameworks, I agree. I mean, there are lots of countries where women still don't have the right to have a bank account, to own land title, to inherit assets. And actually, those are major impediments to them being able to ever become economically active.
Okay, you're now sitting on a kind of a UN panel.
Yes.
How do you, on that panel, begin to affect? I mean, we can do the reports and so forth, but how do we talk to the governments about getting those very basic mechanisms that exist in the Western world everywhere?
Well, partly it's setting. There is a public policy agenda around this. There's no getting away from that, and part of that is setting out a business case. If you talk to the Ethiopian government, they have worked out that if they get every girl through secondary school, that's worth $4 billion a year to their economy. So, and that brings me on to the third bit, which is around the role of finance and treasury ministers and all of that in this. And it's why this issue of gender-responsive budgeting is really important. And interestingly, on the World Bank, the previous finance minister of Nigeria, Ngozi, that many people in this room may know, was really pushing to get finance ministries looking at gender-based budgeting, so that this was really mainstreamed across government policy, starting in finance departments where often, policy runs out of. And the second point I really wanted to make on that is this matters because then actually that gets you into the broader domestic resource mobilisation agenda of how can you make sure that countries' taxation systems are set up for success, so that as the economy grows and more jobs are created, A, that women have access to them, but B, when the economy grows, the tax receipts are there then for countries to reinvest in all of the public services that people rely on, just as we have here in the UK, and things like the Addis Tax Initiative are critical, but this is like a big jigsaw puzzle really, where there are lots of these different pieces. The more you can put in place for each country, then the stronger their ability to affect women's economic empowerment will be. And that's the challenge. There's no silver bullet. So we have to look in the round at how we can do as many of these things as possible and make sure that they take you beyond that kind of tipping point so that they really do have a dramatic change on the ground.
Thank you, Justine. Tina, can I ask you about this question? Can I also ask you quite specifically where gender-responsive budgeting has worked? It's a good example.
Well, I'd like to say one thing, which is we on the panel are here in listening mode, and you are a room full of experts with amazing expertise. So I would very much like to hear from you what you think we should do rather than simply tell us all these things that we may not be experts in. You are experts. You're in the field and in the trenches and everything else. So observations are as welcome as demands for things that you think are the most important, because it's quite overwhelming to sit here and realize that the time that we have to come up with the proposal is short. So that's a plea for this being a two-way conversation. I think that there are a few things that have been said that I would point to, and one is targets, I think. The Women 20, which is still in a very nascent stage, initiative of the G20, is an interesting one because it would, of course, they are not binding, but it would set targets for the G20 member states, and that includes what in my line of work I call non-democracies. And so far there's some receptivity to this. I think the second point has already been raised, and that is providing a new vocabulary for talking about these challenges. For better or worse, and I come from a human rights background, and in my postgraduate education, the language of rights and morality has not really gotten very far.
Mm-hmm.
And we hear Secretary Greening talking about the business case, which has impressed me because, I talk about the data. But in both respects, we're talking about doing more than stating things that need to be done, but putting some structure around the scale of the challenge and the upside potential. That's not enough, but it certainly helps at a time when governments in advanced economies have less to give away for all kinds of reasons which we might debate, but most people go into government to give things away, not to take things away. So this is a difficult challenge for them to have. And then the third point is the mainstreaming idea. Also perhaps counterintuitively or in ways that we might debate over a glass of wine is unfortunate. Making these challenges less about women and more about families, I think also seems to resonate. So we talked about education for women, girls and reproduction. Well, how about men? When the Zika virus warnings came out and told women not to get pregnant, it didn't say to tell men not to kind of do their contribute to their part of the bargain. So I find in my work that there's one conversation about people, and then there's another conversation about women, which is interesting. You look at the polling data, for example, in the U.S. There's sort of voters, and then there's women voters, and I say, how is this possible? So, this is reframing things and describing them with a vocabulary that makes it harder and less convenient to ignore, and also we want to show how expensive it is to maintain these policies through inaction.
Okay, can I ask Fiza about Pakistan in particular?
Yeah.
How responsive has your government been to the idea of gender-responsive budgets? How high up the agenda?
I'll just quickly take you through exactly what's happening right now. One, of course, the belief is that to actually get any real action achieved, there has to be a strong tie-in of the public and the private sector. The public sector can make the right policies, but the private sector has to come in to make sure those policies are happening. Goes for the pay wages, goes for the domestic workers, the migrants. How responsive the government has been, Joy, I must say that after the high-level panel, the first meeting we had in March, I went back to Pakistan and met the Chief Minister of Punjab, the province Punjab, which is one of the key provinces, and got them to set up a Women Economic Empowerment Council that is now working on an objective task force of 16 tasks, which includes everything from getting the home-based workers policy approved to allocating a budget for women with infrastructure development for separate public toilets, working women hostels, childcare centers, a separate transportation for women, to getting the corporates to sign up the WEPU and Global Compact principles, to getting academia to set up mentoring councils. They have been, and it's a long list, it's a 16 objective list, but they've been extremely responsive, and they've immediately set down a committee which has 12 ministers with me.
Has this surprised you?
It did. I actually, the panel members must remember when we had a meeting in March, I set down this call for action and I said, okay, God, I've said it, now what do I do? And I went back and I set up a meeting with the minister, with the chief minister. And I laid it out to him and I said, I've declared there, I'm sorry. And they accepted, they agreed. They set up the women committee, the council immediately with 12 ministers that are working very closely with me. And the good thing was I thought the committee is done, now what? Progress is happening and they're responding. Budgets have been allocated for the June Action Development Plan, the ADP in June. So I thought that, when you have your will in place and the right pressure and the and a platform like the UN High Level Panel, things can happen.
Okay, that's a governmental thing.
Yeah.
There's questions coming from Kapila Horhi at PwC, and this is actually a question, I think, to the whole room, which is, what key successes have you seen that large global corporates can support to drive women's economic empowerment? So whichever field you're working in, could you sort of sit down and think, well, what have you actually seen that has made a difference? What has changed the kind of status quo for the better? Do you have any examples of this?
Well, I was just thinking that a few days ago, maybe 1 week ago, I was in a panel of APEC.
OPEC?
Yes, APEC.
APEC.
Is APEC, the Asian Pacific Economic, well. And I decided to make a little research about microfinance in the APEC countries and how were the profits of this microfinance, especially with the credits given to women. And also relating this with women economic empowerment and the sustainable development goals. And what I see when they invite me to this conference, nothing was about the sustainable development goals. It wasn't in the agenda. So I decided to put this, and I think that we must work with G20 and APEC and all these international meetings to put the sustainable development goals in an agenda and a priority task. And then women economic empowerment. If we don't work with these big meetings, well, we only, maybe we have a very good report, but we have to share all this and, well, to try to make some, to relate, to engage more people in this one. Because I think that one of the most important things that I heard here is that we are working for the children of the society of the future.
I think we've talked a lot about kind of government and kind of high-level committees now. Now I think we're trying to sort of talk about how to actually let these things develop in societies, which often happens through corporate as well as government action. So if some of you could throw some ideas on that. I'd like to take a few more questions from the room, please. I know there was somebody at the back here who had a question.
Hi, my name is Antoinette Salah. I'm an agricultural consultant. Thank you for the panelists. I'm very passionate about agricultural development, and there hasn't been no mention about the rural women and their work in society, in their communities. So my question to the panel is, how will the panel ensure that the rural women have the same rights as their urban women? In terms of childcare, I mean, it was mentioned earlier on by Claire, but also in terms of training and education and acquired skills. We see that many women in many emerging countries and developing countries do lack the training in agriculture, in farming, in the know-how. It's not about just graduating, having degrees, but actually knowing how to do the business of farming in terms of improving their productivity, but also their production by accessing modern tools, modern equipment. And also I have a question to Fiza. How is access to solar energy impacting the lives of women?
Thank you. Okay, we have another question over right at the front here. Yep.
Thank you, Jessica Woodruff from the Gender and Development Network. I wanted to answer the question that was put by somebody online about what corporates could do. Because one of the things that I think many of us have seen is that what's really effective is an increase in public services, whether it's healthcare, whether it's childcare, whether it's water. That's what reduces women's unpaid burden, therefore allows them to take up work opportunities. Increases in public services requires money. So the most important thing that corporates can do is pay their taxes. And those corporates that are already paying their taxes, the most important thing that they can do is not lobby against regulation of other corporates who are not paying their taxes.
Somebody just to your right.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Michelle Chivunga, and I'm a senior consultant looking at global policy issues and also a business owner. I used to work in banking prior to setting up my own company. It's not really a question. I think it's more of providing solution really to some of the issues that have been raised today. I think one of the key issues, if you're going to tackle it at scale, as you were saying, is very much also working on the ground level and working with local people and really trying to work with local women in communities as well as men, engaging the men on the issue, because I think that's quite critical. And one way of doing that is obviously engaging the women, but also you're looking at things, bigger things, like there's a whole huge, range of SMEs that are coming up, especially those led by women, and in many of the communities and many of the developing countries as well. So I think it is really important, one, to provide education, to these women about what, be it SMEs, be it whatever sector you're talking about, but also providing mentoring and education within those local communities. And then those women, I think it was, I can't remember who on the panel mentioned, the agents of change. I think those are, the agents of change who will make a real difference, I think, for the long term in terms of sustainability. So I think that's quite critical. Another, sort of issue that I wanted to kind of point out is that I think there should be closer engagement, be it government, be it private sector, be it local community groups working together collectively. Very much so around, government departments, I think, joining our forces. We hear a lot from international development, departments, from the whole range of government departments, but I think they need to unite and work together a bit more closely.
Okay.
And then last thing, really, I think in terms of scaling up, I mean, you look at things like in the humanitarian circles, we very much, talk around cash transfer programs and things like that. I think those are the things that you can look into. They are working in certain circumstances. They don't work in everything, but I think those are the things that you can look at to scale up and increase. Thank you.
Sorry, we had a question over here, or a statement, or a comment, or a useful contribution.
Hello, my name is Fatima Kelleher. I'm with WISE Development, which is a network of consultants working on women's empowerment, in particular economic empowerment. There are a lot of big budget programs happening on the ground in private sector development and economic development. Market systems approaches is, I suppose, one of the largest areas in this. And within that, there are huge women numbers. So talking about targets and the importance of targets and the opportunities, perhaps, that we can have in order to harness large numbers is certainly there. But there are huge concerns at the same time.
Yeah.
And one of those is that, when we talk about women's economic empowerment, a lot of these programs, because they're in the private sector development field or sector and economic development sector, don't really look at women's economic empowerment as their primary aim. So I'm actually consulting on quite a few of those at the moment. In northern Nigeria, more broadly, there are about 5 or 6 going on at the moment. And there's a real struggle in terms of getting a we analysis into those development programs. And I suppose my question really, therefore, is going forward with the high-level panel, bringing together this sort of group of experts, how do we ensure that that group of programs, which are very big budget, have the potential to offer us lots of research data, if only we will actually create budget envelopes within them for research, meaningful research, which at the moment, in my experience, is not happening in the way that it should do. How do we ensure that they come into the fold of this debate in the same way, and not just those very targeted women's economic empowerment programs, which do tend to have smaller numbers overall?
There's a question at the back.
Hi, my name's Claire from Tier Fund. So Tier Fund, for us the key is relationships in terms of answering the question around women's economic empowerment. And some of our work has been brought out of the work that we've been doing around sexual and gender-based violence. So we've got a programme around transforming masculinities, which is getting together men and boys to talk about issues around gender, masculinity, protection, and also faith. So lots of communities we work in, faith leaders are real key role models in that community. So asking the panel, how are you going to plan to engage with faith leaders as role models to change attitudes and behaviour at community and international level?
Okay. And one more here.
Tina, mine are just comments.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's from a micro level.
Okay.
Very micro level.
Can I just ask you to keep them relatively short?
Yes.
Thank you.
One of the things Afisa said was that the solar energy project helped women. The whole question is the ownership, because women took the ownership of the solar energy, and that's an important aspect. The other thing is, I agreed with the lady just now about culture, religion, attitudes, and I think Justine also referred to attitudes. Very briefly, I was working with UNESCO at that stage. I went to northern Kenya in the desert. They had identified someone who was, it was a man, who was the hero, the shifter, mover, whatever, shaker of this whole thing of women's doing away with women, FGM. And so I was told to connect with him, and we went out together. We were together for the whole week. On the way back to Nairobi, I just asked a very silly, stupid question. And I said, I'm sure your daughters haven't been circumcised. And he took a deep breath. And he said to me, I'll tell you because we are friends. He said, I circumcised my daughters.
Oh my
and he's a champion against. And I said, why? And he said, who will marry them? Who will marry them? And this whole thing of attitudes and faith and culture. And I was quiet-eyed because I'd been with him. He was talking passionately about doing away with this practice. And yet he said, who will marry my daughters? And clearly there was pressure from his wife, from the elders, everybody else. So this is going to be a very slow movement of changing attitudes. And then the other one thing I just want to say is that although we may give women economic empowerment, I've been in a case where a group of women had no savings, nothing. They were in fact women of the street, and a group of nuns took them. The bank was quite far away, so they taught them dressmaking, hairdressing, basket weaving, a whole lot of skills. And they began to make money, and they gave it to the nuns, and the nuns had an accounting sheet with them. And they would go to the bank once a week and put their money in the bank with their names there. Once these women had left the center, there was a problem of demand for their skills. So we're talking about empowering women. There was the supply. There were far too many of them with hairdressing. There were far too many of them with whatever. And someone mentioned the thing about the rural women. It's this whole thing of getting the economy moving, the demands sector, because supply will then come in.
Absolutely.
Okay, those are a few comments I wanted to make.
Thank you. They're very interesting. I think particularly the changing the culture around these things, which in fact doesn't necessarily relate distinctly to money, but clearly to the economy, but clearly does have a huge impact. I'd also just like to throw in a quick question from online, which was about actual specific regional differences. This is from Abi M. Kadir at Sheffield University. And he wonders whether you guys are considering compiling evidence by region, e.g. Africa, Latin America, Asia, systematically, as the constraints faced by women are different but not universal across regions. He also says he's surprised we do not have an expert on Africa in the panel of speakers, but I think we have a few experts actually in the audience. Would you like to talk a little bit about culture and what you've understood from the data you've understood about different cultures? No? Yes?
You can see it in the data. The part of the world actually with the lowest rate of female labor force participation is South Asia, followed by the Middle East. In fact, you've already said that. Sorry, Pakistan coming in last, but we're seeing acceleration in many other areas. I would give an example, by the way, in developed countries, just so that we sort of have a contrast. If you think about one social agenda that has made enormous progress over the last 25 years, it's marriage equality. And that's a very interesting test case. Now, it's not exactly the same, but social attitudes toward gay marriage equality, have changed more rapidly than any others. Yeah. And it's an interesting parallel. So we mustn't think that they can never change. As much as we spend time in cultures and we get a bit nativist when we do this, and I have 10 years of field work experience behind me before I came to banking too, change does happen. Why did that campaign work so well? And in Ireland, a country where the role of the clergy was very powerful indeed, how did that happen? And if there's lessons to be learned from social attitudes on gay marriage and toward homosexuality in general, can we not apply those to women in a more effective way? And can we not apply them in different contexts?
So if you're talking about South Asia and the Middle East as having the least female engagement in, sorry, did you say in the economy or the employment market?
In the labour force.
In the labour force. This is less to do with the economic power of those countries and more to do with the attitude, the cultures of
culture.
women working.
Well, and we have to break out the GCC countries versus Arab League countries because they have very, very different levels of development and growth and everything else. But one of the things that's interesting to think about is how even in the Arab League countries, investment in parity in education for boys and girls has worked and has worked very well. So, framing things in terms of return on investment is important. But the Arab Spring, had a lot of girls and women involved. Again, as a social scientist, I look at demographic cohorts, younger people, girls and boys, men and women, expecting more, expecting to participate in society. When they aren't given those opportunities, they might be suppressed maybe for a long time, but it won't go away.
Justine, would you like to comment on how a UN panel can begin to shift culture specifically?
I think it's important to diagnose the problem and to understand it if you want to be able to fix it. And what's coming out of this is that we shouldn't just see women's economic empowerment as a finance issue. Actually, there is a heavy element of attitudes, culture, and we've seen this. I think we can learn a lot actually from progress on FGM in many countries. In some cases, it's about marriage, and actually behind that might be an issue of dowry that's there too. And how do you fix that? Well, you actually fix it through education and jobs and having women and girls seen as something not just that's not the only value that they have to the family is the dowry when they get married. So it's all inextricably linked. But actually, the key to success is understanding how to sort of steadily unpick it. And in some families and communities, it will be more about the economics. In others, it will be much, much more about just expectations and culture and family pressure on girls to just simply conform to what's expected, irrespective of the money around it. And therefore, the answer to this, and as in so many other policy areas, is you sort of need this last mile element to it. So you can have an overall framework which has got the basic elements of a successful strategy, but in the end, it needs to be tailored. And if you talk to the government in Ethiopia and some of the ministers who've been involved in that approach to try and steadily bear down on FGM, they literally have had to work with 85 plus different languages and different community groups to try and tailor their programs. And I'm afraid that's partly why this is such a difficult agenda to move forward on. But I'm afraid that's what we have to confront, that there's a complexity to it that means you might have some basic strategy, but then it needs to be tailored for that last mile on the community level. And you need to identify the community leaders and the local role models, and that's where it all starts to get pulled together. So in a sense, what you're saying is it's a bit like painting by numbers. You'll know what the basic picture looks like, but you'll have a slightly different shade of response depending on where you're going to try and put it in place successfully.
Okay, so Fisa?
Yes, I just want to quickly add something to what Justin just said in terms of adapting programs for making it more culturally acceptable and more acceptable to both genders. The project that we had for empowering rural women, of course, it wasn't that easy to go into completely bottom of the pyramid rural villages in Pakistan and say that, we want to empower your women here. We're going to make them the agents of change. There was a lot of resistance. And then we learned to adapt and we learned to make it more acceptable. How we did that was that we added an element of creating a technical agent from every village, a male member of the village, usually the husband or the brother or the father of the light lady, and giving him the technical trainings to monitor and maintain the village, the solar charging station. So that basically gave him the added empowerment that he's a very critical part of the model. It actually did become a critical part of the model because now it's technically sustainable too, and it made both the forces work together towards our eventual goal. So yes, adaptation and bringing the other gender to understand the role of women economic empowerment is critical, especially when you go down to the field.
Okay, we're going to come to a close. We're getting to the end of our session. It's been incredibly broad, and I think because of the breadth of discussion, I think you might realise the challenges that are actually facing the panel and what they come together. And we've covered everything, and not, even in any depth. There was a question on the agricultural communities we haven't answered. There was a question on technology we couldn't even get through. There was a question on childcare we didn't come to any answers on. I think actually this last discussion on culture and the economy has begun to kind of tease out one of the problems, which is that one can talk about the economy, we can talk about business, but in fact one has to talk about the cultures that have to change in order to actually start pushing business to change as well. I'm going to ask the panel just to make some very short, very brief final comments, and I think there will be time afterwards if you have any specific questions to speak to them. So Tina, would you like to sum up in 3 sentences?
3 sentences. Map the problem with as much substance as possible. Focus on the accelerators that can help the most people in the shortest period of time, and maintain the momentum. If you focus on the problems, you won't get started.
Fiza?
Yeah, sure. So very briefly, I think after mapping the problems, identify the priority areas which are critical. After identification of the priority areas, of course, leading to solutions and a strategy of achieving the solutions. We all know the solutions, but the how is very important, how to achieve it. And then take a step further from advocacy to action. And in addition to advocacy, create those demonstrations and case studies that can then be replicated with scale around the world.
Well, I would like to say that economy change culture, and it is very important because the characteristics of the family 5 decades ago were father, mother, and children, and maybe 2 or 3, 4, 5 children. Now the family is mother with their children, father with their children, grandparents with their children, and we have changed a lot. So I think the economy, and especially because many women are in the labor market, many, not only culture, but other things are transforming this world.
Okay, in fact, what I didn't mention was there was the ODI did a Twitter poll as to what the biggest barriers to women's economic empowerment was, and it takes up your point, which is the structure of the family has changed dramatically, and 51% of people said it's unpaid work and childcare, and what needs to happen to change is it's the family structures that need to change. Justine?
Okay, well, I'll try and sort of add to what people have said. I think it comes down to more and better jobs, but also not forgetting the informal sector. So you need an approach that covers the whole of that. I think there is an issue on attitudes and then data. I've lumped those 2 things together so that I still have room for a third thing to say, which is going to be, don't forget men and boys. And what we haven't really talked about much today is the men and boys piece of this, but it is critical. And it comes back to Tina's point in a way. So and I think business can play a big role in changing attitudes of men and boys, because they're often the employees in the more formal sector that are there. Yeah. So that would be my final one.
Well, thank you very much. I think this discussion obviously does not end here. You've all got the contact details for the ODI. Questions that are open, please feel free to kind of continue your responses forward, and they will get forwarded on. I'd like to thank each of the panel members who've taken time and energy to appear here, to open the discussion, and to bring their own expertise to it. And I'd also like to thank the High-Level Panel Secretariat, DFID and the ODI for organising this event this afternoon, and also to thank the audience, both those who've turned up in person and those online, for all your contributions. There are refreshments afterwards. There will be an opportunity to speak to some of the speakers afterwards with more specific conversations. And thank you very much for all being here today to make this event possible. Thank you.